Hello, everyone, and welcome. Today, we're here to discuss a sometimes dry topic, sometimes a frustrating topic, and that's how to make your vulnerability management program suck less. I'm Corey Knowles, Managing Editor of Sales, IT, and BI here at Technology Advice. And today, we're joined by Lee Eisenman, Solutions Engineer at Avalor. How are you today, Lee?
Hey, Corey, thanks. I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
Good, glad to have you. Well, let's dive right in. Lee, why do vulnerability management programs tend to suck so bad? And what are the main challenges that organizations face with their current VM solutions?
Yeah, that's a great place to start, Corey. I've got a visual I'm going to share to help us talk through that. Let me share my screen real quick. So, Corey, the industry has been working on vulnerability management for more than 20 years, and we're generations of tooling in, but by most accounts, to put it crudely, VM still sucks.
Yep.
I know very few companies that think that they're doing a good job in this area, and the ones who are not happy with how hard it is. Even the latest, most advanced tools still have major gaps. First, the CVE is still the center of the universe, so enrichment for them is still mostly about vulnerabilities and threat intel, and there's not a lot of info to work from there. And to the extent that these tools do have more sophisticated scoring, looking at exploitability, for example, or the EPSS score, that calculation is still a black box. The vendor doesn't tell you how they get to that score or how they're computing that adjusted score. And many of these tools, as they're looking to handle richer data, they struggle to scale or to perform at scale. We've heard customers who can't get access to the results of the previous night's scan until mid-afternoon the next day. And that's just too long to wait for the processing to occur.
Mm-hmm.
And to the extent that any of them let you create your own path for calculating risk, the options are pretty limited. You're working off a limited set of contextual data in the first place, and weighting isn't fully customizable. So you have the same challenge with workflows as well, with limited Jira integrations and no ability to use custom Jira fields, for example. And because these problems were all built to do just one thing, their data models are oriented around vulnerabilities. It can be hard, for example, to look at an asset from another perspective, like from an asset perspective or from a user perspective, or to include context such as apps or identity with such limited data models. And overall, it's hard to understand the overall state of things, right? To get an overall updated picture of risk. And this is really why we say that VM sucks so much, because the companies have spent all this time and energy deploying all of these tools, but they still don't have this consolidated view, this overall picture of risk.
It's an interesting subject. I think we should take a little step back and talk about vulnerabilities in the first place. What is a vulnerability, and how does it relate in the context of modern tech stacks?
Yeah, so the term vulnerability has really exploded with modern tech stacks. So it used to be that a vulnerability was really just referring to endpoint software, the operating system, or a specific application that was unpatched and had to be patched, and that's a vulnerability.
Yeah.
But now we've expanded that. The initial pivot was, now we're not just talking about physical assets on-prem, but we're talking about cloud VMs that could also have unpatched software, OS or otherwise. But that was just a small pivot. Now, we're increasing that to include misconfigurations in the cloud. So an S3 bucket that is publicly accessible that's not supposed to be, that's a misconfiguration, which is a type of vulnerability. It's introducing risk to the organization. Even application security expanding even further. Things like exposed secrets or unpatched packages that are used in the application. These are packages that are responsible to get updated from third parties, but you have to go and make sure that those, if those vulnerabilities exist, if there's a patch available, you have to apply that patch, even if you didn't write that source code. And so that's another area that can introduce risk and therefore another type of vulnerability. And then even users, if you've got users in your organization that are likely to click on phishing emails, right, then that's a vulnerability as well. So again, in the industry, people tend to think of, when they hear vulnerability management, they tend to think of the traditional patching tools that patch unpatched software, but really the definition would include all of these different types of risk I described. Anything that represents a way in which your organization is at risk or is vulnerable is by definition a vulnerability.
Wow. That stuff goes back so far, and you're right, that is kind of how we think of it in general terms. in there you highlighted that companies already have lots of data. Why is that security data so hard to use?
Yeah. The problem is definitely not a lack of data. In fact, the problem might be the opposite of that, too much data, or the fact that data itself is not useful or actionable. And to prepare for this session, I asked ChatGPT, what's the difference between data and information? And I thought the answer that it gave back actually really provided a good framework to dig into this a little bit more. So it says data refers to raw, unprocessed facts and figures without any context, whereas information is data that has been processed, organized, structured, or presented in a given context so as to make it meaningful or useful. And this really hits a nail on the head when you think through each of those points. So the variety of tools that are sending the customers data based on each of their own vendors' definitions, it's disparate data with their own terminology, their own vernacular, their own ways of measuring risk. This all needs to be reconciled, as ChatGPT says. In order to make use of the data and convert it to information, the first thing we have to do is we have to process it. We have to cleanse it. So if you've got data coming in from multiple tools, even if it's reporting on the same kind of asset, like 3 different tools reporting on a virtual machine, they might be using different terminology to refer to that, even if it's really slightly different, like virtual machine crammed together as one word with no space between, or with a hyphen between, or all caps, or all lowercase. All of those are going to look different. And if you try to pull reports from 3 different tools that are using a different version of that word, and then try to run a report and aggregate them, it's not going to aggregate on that if they're different. So you've got to make sure that you process that up front, which again is exactly part of that definition. It said data has been processed. The next part of the definition was organized and structured. So you really need a well thought out data model to take all of this data and put it in so that you can properly organize it and make use of it. And then finally, context. That was the last thing that it says is presented in a given context to make it meaningful or useful. So context can be things like the environment that the asset is in. Is it in a development or a production environment? Does the asset have PII on it? Is it behind a firewall? These are things that give you additional business context around the asset that can also, that's also really important. But if you don't have the right data model, to your question, you have all of this data, but you don't have a way to make use of it. You've got all this context, but you don't have the right platform or program to make use of it. And so, the reality is most companies don't have this. They just have exports. And so the onus is on the analyst to build pivot tables, pull the reports, et cetera. And that's really what makes it so hard to use.
Yeah, that's the never-ending struggle with data, isn't it? That was a great definition, though. That last point you made about vendor-defined analysis, how does that impact how organizations can understand risk in their own environments?
Yeah, each vendor's got their own lens collecting data from its own vantage point. So asset tools provide data about assets. Scanners provide data on CVEs or that more narrow definition of vulnerability. EDR tools are providing information or providing data on the endpoint. So none of these consider the totality of the environment, basically because they simply can't. They don't have the right vantage point or the right information to provide the right context. But when you do have when they do have some context, as I mentioned in the upfront, the problem is it's a black box. They don't give you the ability to see exactly how this data is being converted into information. You can't adjust or extend the model. And so frankly, this is why we say that VM programs suck, because the participants in the program can't make the adjustments that they'd like to make or want to make. And most of these programs are hard-coded and fixed.
So if a CVE isn't our only vulnerability, then a CVSS score probably isn't our only risk indicator. What other factors would companies benefit from looking at to understand that risk?
Yeah, I've got another slide I'm going to present to talk through this one. Let me get my screen share going one more time here. Okay, so let's say that a tool identifies that you've got an asset with a CVE that has a CVSS score of 7.0. So that's your starting point. And now what do you do with that? Is it something you need to take action on right now? What if there's other CVEs that also have CVSS scores of 7.0? That's really the main point. So let's take 2 examples. So for the first one, you have additional context. And so you know that this specific system with the CVE in the first example is an asset that has EDR on it. And now that you've got that additional context, the risk should be lowered a little bit because that EDR is going to provide its own protection. Then the second detail you pick up on is that it's in a development environment. It's not a production asset. So again, that additional context causes the risk to go down as well. So for this particular asset, just these two pieces of context are going to really take that CVSS score of 7 and ultimately suggest that this is a low risk situation. Then we take another situation where we have a second asset that again starts with a CVE with a CVSS score of 7, but this one's exposed to the internet, so it's publicly accessible. That's a risk. That's going to cause the severity in this situation to go up. And it has a known exploit. So some CVEs, in fact, a lot of them haven't been exploited in the wild. So it's theoretically a vulnerability, but there's nothing that's been weaponized to take advantage of it. But if we have the context to distinguish whether that's the case or not, and we incorporate that into the model, as we've done here, then you can see that the fact that it has a known exploit is going to increase the risk. And then just continuing with a couple more examples, what if it also has access to or has PII on it? So that's going to increase the risk even more. And then you've got a user who uses this machine that is prone to clicking on phishing links. So, you know, when you add up all of these details on this asset compared to the first asset, you can see that even though the two situations start the same with a CVE with the same CVSS score, the actual risk is quite different. And so that's really what you want to do. You don't want to just be using CVSS. You want to be factoring as much context that you can in order to drive your program.
Nice. Well, knowing that, how can organizations effectively aggregate their vulnerabilities, risk factors, and mitigating controls into a comprehensive view?
Yeah, from talking to customers, they're really starting to realize that they have a data problem. They're pulling data in from all these tools, but it's giving them disparate information. And like you said, they need to figure out how to aggregate it. So what they need to do is aggregate it and put it into a comprehensive view. It's all about pulling posture data, user behavior data, and environmental controls into that single data lake and giving them the ability to make adjustments as they need to fit their environment. And as we've discussed, this is why it's so critical to have a well-formed data model. You need a data model that's going to give you that flexibility. And again, it's not just about a data model that perfectly meets your requirements today, but one that's extensible and flexible so that maybe initially you don't have a DSPM tool, for example, a data security posture management tool that's telling you about PII on an asset. So initially when you build out your program, it doesn't factor that in, but then you acquire that technology. And what's it going to take now to retrofit your VM program to now factor that in? You want to make sure that it's going to be relatively simple and straightforward. And that's exactly what we've done at Avalor. We don't scan your systems. We're not the scanner, but we analyze the data coming from all of your existing systems. And we do the things that we've discussed. We normalize it, we correlate it, and we provide you an accurate and actionable list of your top priorities, your top issues, as well as the ability to report on it via customizable dashboards and to provide that information in a way that's important to you based on how you want to see it.
Oh, that's huge. That is really huge. How can risk assessments be tuned to align more with an organization's specific needs and metrics in a vulnerability management program?
Yeah, that really captures the essence of it. It's not assuming or trying to shop for a product that aligns with your organization, but finding one that's flexible enough that can be tuned. And that's really the key here. And so it starts with that centralized collection point, right? Working off of a flexible data model and that allows you to ingest the data from a variety of sources, deduplicate them. So you might have multiple sources reporting on the same assets or the same vulnerabilities. You've got to do that deduplication. You've got to normalize, like I talked about. The example I gave with the term virtual machine showing up in slightly different iterations. And then you need to be able to apply your definition of risk by taking into consideration the factors that you consider to be relevant, both risk factors and mitigation factors, right? Risk factors are those things that cause the dots to go up on that screen I showed, and mitigation factors would be things that cause it to go down, right? If you've got EDR on it, or if it's behind a firewall, or if it's in a dev environment, those are all mitigating factors. If it's exposed to the internet, if it's got PII on it, et cetera, then those are risk factors. So you've got to be able to take those things into account. And then you need reporting that captures metrics as you've defined them with those customizable dashboards. So you can see what's important to you with trending to show you how things have changed over time. You really need to be careful not to just look for a technology that has some dashboards that look good at your first use case, because you're going to evolve over time, and you really need the ability to customize those dashboards. So you've got a good starting point, but then as your organization grows, your reporting cadence can grow with it.
Yeah, that's a trap a lot of people get into, is they fall for the flashy dashboards and not specifically what they need.
Mm-hmm.
What are the challenges in assigning fixes that match an organization's structure, and how can these be overcome?
Yeah, that's a major challenge. Getting a great a great to-do list is only step one. If the fixes never get done or sent to the right people in a format they can consume, then you never make any progress. And it doesn't matter how good your everything else we've talked about is, whether it's reporting or prioritization, getting everything normalized. If you're not actually getting the information into the hands of the people that need to act on it, then you haven't, developed an effective program. And this requires a system that lets you map items to the right assignee. In some cases, you want to group findings together. So when we talk about these source systems, like your vulnerability management systems or your CSPM, they're providing findings. And sometimes they're findings on common assets or common vulnerabilities that can be addressed with a common action. And so you want to group those findings together to be more efficient. In other cases, you might want to break things out so that you can have different people working on different issues. And so you really need, a platform that can handle that for you. And you also want to ensure that your system can integrate with your existing ticketing system, if it's Jira, ServiceNow, et cetera. And you want to look for something that's got bi-directional updating. So if the users prefer to stay in their ticketing system, then that's fine. But when they make updates to the ticket, that gets propagated back to your vulnerability management program, and then vice versa. If they're making changes within that platform, you want that to update the ticket on the other side as well.
Yeah. Can you share a success story where, say, an organization transformed its VM program to overcome some of these challenges?
Yeah, absolutely. We have several examples. I'll just share one. A really big company we work with defines 4 pillars for effective vulnerability management: scan the assets, report, remediate, and verify. And with the traditional VM tooling, they could only accomplish the first 2. They could scan to find the vulnerabilities, and then they could report on them. But the next 2 essential steps that they just couldn't implement. They didn't have the ability to weave in the business context needed for effective prioritization. So they couldn't consistently get a good list of the needed fixes over to the development teams. And therefore, remediation was really compromised. On the few occasions where some highly critical vulnerability did get addressed, the company had no way to automatically validate that the fixes had been applied. But by pulling in all of their risk factors and their mitigating controls, they got more accurate to-do lists so that things were prioritized properly. And by funneling that information into the workflows built specifically for them, they got the work done. And then by having that auto-validation done on the remediation of tickets, they got the continuous updates on the status, which includes knowing if a ticket was closed that shouldn't have been. I get asked that quite a lot. How do we know if the ticket was closed appropriately? And so it's really important that you have a platform that does that, and that's of course something that we offer. So they finally built a full scope vulnerability management program by getting the processes in place for the whole second set of pillars.
Oh, wow. In the context of an always evolving tech landscape, how can VM programs stay ahead of various new types of vulnerabilities, because they're always coming?
Flexibility. Am I allowed to give just one word answers? No?
One
All
word
right,
answers?
I'll elaborate. So flexibility in every aspect of the program. Data ingestion, right? We've talked about this, like flexibility in the way that you ingest data so that you can adapt to differences in the way that information is presented, and it evolves over time. A new field gets added in a source vendor from the vendor source, and you want to incorporate that into your model. You need a flexible program that supports that. Prioritization, being able to have a flexible model to define your prioritization. And again, you add DSPM, you didn't have it before, but now you add it, you definitely want to factor that in. So you need flexibility. Grouping, How tickets are or findings are grouped together into tickets, same thing. You need flexibility. And then assignment, same thing, right? It's quite possible that your team grows over time. So maybe when you start, you have a single end user computing team that's managing tickets for the entire world. But then you grow and you have, whatever the case may be, one team for Europe and one team for North America. And so now you need to route tickets differently based on that. And so you need, a platform that's flexible and that can allow you to make those changes without Herculean effort, or without having to go back to the vendor and ask them to enhance their platform.
Yeah,
So you need a platform that was built with extensibility in mind.
that makes sense. Makes a lot of sense. What role does automation play in enhancing the efficiency and effectiveness of VM programs?
Yeah, VM programs just can't keep up without automation. Just as you need flexibility through every facet, like I just explained, you need automation as well. When you're doing data ingestion, prioritization, grouping, assignment, you need automation. When people say their VM program sucks, it's often because they spend all their time compiling data manually in spreadsheets, trying to turn that data into information, as we've discussed. But that leaves them precious little, if any, time to truly act on that information. And by the way, acting on the information is what the people who applied for and were hired, what they want to do. And
Yeah.
so by implementing a platform that enables them to spend more time doing that, job satisfaction is going to go up, as well as your ability to retain employees and drive down risk within the organization. And then another point that comes up with automation is currency. And when we hear that word, we always think about like dollars or whatever. But currency also means the degree to which something is current. And so our customers tell us that it's not only super time consuming to compile all this information, but partly as a result of that, it is never up to date. The time it takes them to compile causes it to be stale. But also, if it takes you 6 hours to generate a report, you're not going to have your team do that every day, because that's going to literally take one person to pretty much do nothing but that. So you end up doing it like maybe once a month or once a quarter. And what that results in is your data is very stale. But when you have automation, which is the topic of this discussion here at the moment, now the platform's working on your behalf. You configure it up front, and now it's on autopilot. So you have, when you pull a report, it's showing you the information as of right now. It's current, and that's a game changer.
That is, and the ability to automate that is an impressive feat. How can organizations balance the need for comprehensive vulnerability management with the reality of the limited resources we see today?
Yeah, we get asked this all the time. How many people does it take to run Avalor? And the reality is, it takes far less time with Avalor than it takes to do all of the manual work you have now if you're going to do that without Avalor. And the reality is, you have to have a vulnerability management program, and you really need to be considering all of the things we've been discussing today. So the question isn't whether you're going to proceed down this path, but whether you're going to proceed down this path manually or with technology to help you.
Yeah.
So the reality is that the automation that we've talked about, that's key. We have to use automated tooling rather than manual effort to get ahead. Yeah. Gartner data shows that more exploits actually happen against medium risk CVEs. And this seems a little bit counterintuitive, but those are the ones that typically don't get addressed because vulnerability management teams are overwhelmed and inundated. So they only focus on the highs and criticals. And so those mediums are the ones that sometimes get targeted because they know that the bad actors know those aren't going to get addressed. Yeah. So companies are suffering from these mediocre programs, and they're falling further behind. We really need to empower them to reverse that trend. And again, we need to free up the practitioners from spending so much time compiling data, allowing them to spend more time taking action on the information or insights that they've derived from that data.
Absolutely. Well, Lee, where can people go to learn more about Avalor?
Yeah, they can certainly come to our website at avalor.io. They can send us an email at contact@avalor.io, and they can also find us on LinkedIn and Twitter.
Cool. Well, Lee, thanks so much for joining us today. It's been a fun and interesting chat. Again, I'm Corey Knowles with Technology Advice, and want to thank everyone who attended today. Good luck on your journey to work smarter through technology.